Alright guys, so recently I purchased this Fuji X-T1 to see what all the rage is about. Now I needed a lens to test this camera out with. I naturally went with one of the least practical focal lengths out there, the 16mm f2.8 lens. Right? This is a weather resistant lens, which is one of the things that attracted me. And it's just so compact, light, and not as expensive, frankly, as some of Fuji's other offerings. So I bought this lens for a very specific reason. I actually wanted to do a photo project related to intersections in the city. And so naturally I gravitated towards something that would give me a very wide field of view. In this case, 16mm in full frame terms would be around a 24mm field of view. Now, we're going to get into the sample photos in just a bit, but as always, I want to go over the things I liked, the things I didn't like, and finally some advice for shooting with a wider focal range, such as this one. Something that you get used to when looking over Fuji lenses in general is that they're all pretty good. I mean, there's not really a bad one in the bunch from what I can gather, and they're all really sharp and optically quite nice, and this one is no exception. What I really liked about it, especially someone coming from a full frame DSLR world, is just how tiny, and absolutely tiny, this thing is. I mean, I realize there are Fuji lenses like the 18, the 27 that are smaller, but this little compact guy, I mean, I hesitate to use the word cute in everyday contexts, but this lens is positively cute, especially when you pair it with the little lens hood it comes with. Look at it. Unobtrusive, unintimidating on the street, which is exactly where I wanted to use it. Its small size means it has a small filter thread of 49mm, so you can save some money if you choose to buy filters. It's extremely lightweight, exactly as its size would suggest. It's weather resistant, and Fuji claims it can be used in temperatures as low as 14 degrees Fahrenheit, which is -10 Celsius, which is really attractive. I think if you're someone who lives in colder climates and just wants a no-nonsense lens they can go out with and not have to worry about. This lens is sharp, guys. It's sharp in the center, it's sharp in the corners, it's even sharp wide open. Now, obviously, sharpness improves dramatically as you stop down even a little bit, and I think by 5.6, you have all the sharpness you may ever want. It's not a very important consideration for me because I know that with modern primes, and especially modern Fuji lenses, they're all going to be sharp enough for all practical purposes. The letters EBC means it has a special EBC coating on the front of the lens, which I believe helps to reduce flare and ghosting considerably. Everything was well controlled. Fringing was well controlled. There's very little of that I had to deal with in post-processing. Now, despite its small size, it still feels really, really solid. It has a metal exterior, so it still inspires confidence. I mean, it just feels like a solid lens, especially with this metal lens mount here. Aperture ring here is a welcome addition, despite the lens being so tiny. You can clearly feel each individual step, and it goes all the way down to f22, which is not something I would use often, but it's nice to know that it's there. I believe stiffer than some of Fuji's older lens designs, which means that you're not likely to knock it around accidentally. This lens is sharp, it's light, it's weather resistant, it's contrasty, it has great build quality. What is not to love? If we're going to nitpick, yes, this lens does not have a distance scale, which certainly makes it less attractive for manually focusing and presetting a focusing distance. Also, it has this focus by wire system, which just keeps on going forever, right? Not really as convenient to manually focus this thing. There is no optical image stabilization with this lens, so something you have to watch out for. And finally, something that is an issue but not really an issue, there is distortion with this lens. There's going to be distortion anyway, but if you're purely buying a lens for architecture, just make sure you leave enough space around the edges of the frame to do your perspective correction later in post-processing. Now, people have reported that this lens is not actually 16mm. It's something closer to 15, which is pretty cool if you want it to go as wide as possible, and Fuji just gives you that extra millimeter for free. And at the wide end of the focal range, every millimeter counts. Now, 2.8 aperture is pretty nice, wide open. You still have a bit of latitude to use this when the light drops, for example. You can still use this lens handheld. Obviously, it's not going to give you that additional 2 stops of light that the 16mm f1.4 lens will give you. But that one is considerably more expensive, larger, and heavier. So that's something we can discuss in the comment section. But I think both of these lenses can coexist in someone's kit. If they're really attracted to this particular focal length, it may make sense to own both of them, or it may make sense to own neither of them. Okay, so it's really up to you and your shooting preferences, your style. This is what the lens looks like on an X-T1. Okay, not too obtrusive on the street. Although, guys, if we're going to be honest, these days, if you bring any camera out onto the street, you will attract attention, because it's just rare enough that someone is going to be shooting with a dedicated camera, that any kind of camera, whether it's a small mirrorless setup like this or a full frame system, is going to attract attention. Now keep in mind, my X-T1 looks a bit larger than usual because I have added this hand grip. Often I will have the lens hood mounted, so this is what the whole setup looks like. Now in terms of autofocus speed, I specifically did not talk about autofocus speed yet because I know I'm using it on an X-T1. A lot of you will be using newer Fuji bodies and will be used to the faster autofocus systems and the new firmware updates associated with that. You can definitely hear it if you put your ear up to the camera, but it's fast enough and it's not that perceptible to me. The most important thing, I believe, when choosing a lens like a 16mm prime is whether you have a use for a 16mm prime. This kind of lens excels really well on the street, for travel, for environmental portraiture, for certain landscape applications, for certain architecture applications, but it is not the most versatile focal length out there. This little 16 gives you something closer to a 24mm, which is a challenging focal length to use. For one, it can often lead to boring images such as this one. Okay, I specifically included it here just to illustrate what can happen if you don't put anything into the foreground. You end up just capturing a lot of everything and just getting a whole lot of nothing in terms of impact. One way to quickly improve images like this, something in the midground, something in the foreground, automatically makes the image more interesting, even if the subject matter isn't. Another way to get around this is to place subjects in the center of the frame. That way the eye knows where to look. Anytime you're dealing with these focal lengths, it's very important to plan your composition in advance. I was shooting this lens at just about any f-stop that I felt was appropriate to get me the depth of field that I wanted, and I wasn't interested at all in bokeh or anything like that. I just wanted stuff to be in focus. Back in the day, 35mm was known as a wide-angle lens, but now with smartphones being around 28 to 30mm, we've all gotten used to that kind of look. So people are moving towards 24 perhaps to be a true wide-angle lens. These lenses are not like Pokemon. You don't need to collect them all. I would choose a lens based on a project you want to do, or based on a specific subject matter that you want to tackle. If you want to do handheld night shots, I would definitely steer you towards the f1.4, just because I was noticing that as the light dropped, I had to increase my ISO considerably. Another way to use this lens is for environmental portraiture. And the fact that the minimum focusing distance is only 17 centimeters means you can get really, really close to your subject. Now, there's going to be some distortion if you put the camera all the way up to a person at that focal length. But I found that dogs don't really care if they look distorted in photos. You're not going to get award-winning bokeh with this lens, okay? And that's not what it was designed for. And who knows, this lens might just be what it takes to push you from a beginner into an amateur, because it will absolutely force you to create more interesting compositions. As something you learn over time is that the wider you go, the harder it is to create a pleasing scene without heavy cropping. I highly recommend you take on a project like this in your own city. Go around the city and try taking a picture at every different major intersection. This is a great little photo assignment, and you can do this with any focal length. You don't need the 16mm. But most importantly, many people where you live might respond quite positively. People just love seeing the intersections where they grew up, where they went to work, where they commute through on a daily basis. And people have strong memories attached to them. So this is a nice project to get yourself a little bit of local photographic exposure as well. If you have experience with this lens or the f1.4, let us know in the comment section. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys later.